5 years following the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka, where does the country stand in terms of reconciliation and accountability? In March this year, the United Nations Human Rights Council will see a third US-sponsored resolution being tabled, which will be backed by Britain and Canada. Where did the country stand in the year 2009? Where does it stand 5 years following the end of the conflict? To discuss all this and more, we have a special guest in the studios this evening. That is the British High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, Mr. John Ranking. A very good evening, sir, and welcome to our show. Mr. High Commissioner, starting off, diplomatic ties between Sri Lanka and the United Kingdom dates back many years. Since 2011, since you took office as the British High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, diplomatic ties between both countries have strained. Do you agree?
Well, the United Kingdom and Sri Lanka, as you've mentioned, have a very strong historical relationship, and we still have very close ties in many areas. Our commercial ties, the UK remains a major investor in this country. Our educational ties with so many Sri Lankan students studying in the UK, and our cultural ties are people-to-people ties. The UK is a friend of Sri Lanka, but we're also an honest friend of Sri Lanka, and sometimes honest friends have frank things to say, and we do have concerns over some of the events happening in this country, which we and others will raise this mark.
Now, trade ties between both countries dates back many years as well, Mr. High Commissioner. How do you intend to strengthen the ties between both countries in terms of trade in the next few years?
Well, at the moment, the European Union as a whole is the largest export market for Sri Lanka, and within the European Union, the UK is by far the largest market. And that's because of the quality of the goods produced here. Sri Lankan apparel, for example, is in high demand because of its high quality and because of the good labour conditions in this country. I want to help encourage further Sri Lankan trade into Sri Lanka, and I want to encourage further UK investment into this country, and we did so, for example, by helping and encouraging so many UK companies to attend the Commonwealth Business Forum last November, and I'll continue to support that two-way trade and investment.
What were the key highlights during your term in office, Mr. High Commissioner? Let's discuss about what happened after 2011.
Well, first of all, we continue to welcome the end of the conflict in this country. No one should mourn the end of LTT terrorism, and that has given the opportunity for strong economic development and given the opportunity for the government to tackle a number of difficult issues, including, for example, the resettlement of internally displaced persons, a good number of whom have now been able to return to their original homes. And I've been able to travel around the country in the time I've been here, south, north, east and west, to see those developments taking place. But there are areas of concern. When Prime Minister David Cameron was here in November, he recognised the great potential and promise of Sri Lanka, but he also said that in order for that potential to be wholly fulfilled, action was required in certain areas of concern on accountability for the events during the conflict, justice for the victims of that conflict, on achieving long-term reconciliation in this country, and on addressing current human rights concerns, for example, over the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law.
Subsequent to the visit undertaken by your Prime Minister during the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in November last year, the Sri Lankan President had reiterated on many occasions, and I quote, Mr. High Commissioner, "We are not under a colony anymore, and that Sri Lanka is an independent sovereign state." Your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. Sri Lanka is an independent sovereign state, as in the United Kingdom. But together, we and other countries have accepted certain international obligations, including obligations under international human rights conventions and as members of the United Nations. And it's quite reasonable for one country to raise with another country concerns if those obligations, in our view, are not being wholly adhered to.
The international community, including Britain, Mr. High Commissioner, since 2010, following the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka, has said that Sri Lanka has to do more in terms of human rights. Now, you just said this a couple of seconds ago as well, responding to to a question that I raised. What is the yardstick in which, Mr. High Commissioner, human rights, accountability, reconciliation are being measured?
Well, first of all, by measuring progress against those international obligations to which both Sri Lanka and the United Kingdom are parties, but also by taking action in areas that the government's own Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission report has recommended. It had clear recommendations on certain areas of accountability and on reconciliation. When David Cameron was here, he made clear that we look to Sri Lanka to establish its own domestic, credible, independent and transparent process to investigate allegations of violations of international humanitarian law. If such a process, domestic process, is established, then the UK government will welcome and
there is a domestic process already in place, that is the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, which was established by the President himself.
The Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission made a number of good recommendations in those areas. What is required now is for those key recommendations to actually be implemented. As I say, if they are implemented, if a credible independent domestic process is established, we will welcome that. It is in the absence of government action to establish such a process that there are now calls, including from the UK government, for an international investigation.
Let me recollect the statement made by your Prime Minister during the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Colombo last year. Your Prime Minister at a media briefing in Colombo said, Mr. High Commissioner, that the United Kingdom will press upon an international investigation against Sri Lanka in March this year.
Absolutely. In the absence of a domestic process, the UK government at Geneva will call for an international investigation.
The Sri Lankan government has reiterated that no international investigation will be allowed in Sri Lanka, Mr. High Commissioner. How does your government intend to press the Sri Lankan government to do this?
Well, first of all, by discussing these issues frankly, but in a friendly fashion, with the government. Our own experience of Northern Ireland, for example, and the experience of other countries such as Rwanda and Sierra Leone, is that having an independent investigation into these issues can actually strengthen long-term reconciliation and stability. So we start off by doing so, by having conversations, by encouraging and hoping that the government will take action. But there are also international mechanisms whereby states can address these issues, and one of those international mechanisms is of course the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where for the past 2 years the international community has voted in favour of resolutions on this issue, and where they will again be debated in Geneva this March.
Nearly 5 years after the end of the conflict, Mr. High Commissioner, can you really achieve progress in terms of reconciliation and accountability? Is that possible? Take into account the context of Northern Ireland as well.
Yeah, not everything can be achieved overnight, and we do recognise the progress that has been made in relation to economic development in the north and east of the country, and the movement that has been made on internally displaced persons. But a clear start has to be made also on some of those other more difficult issues of which I spoke, on addressing reconciliation and on addressing accountability to ensure justice for the victims.
Mr. High Commissioner, the US-sponsored resolution came into effect in March last year, which Britain supported. A few months after, 7 months to be very precise, your Prime Minister says in Colombo that UK will press for an international investigation in March. The resolution clearly states, Mr. High Commissioner, and I quote, request the Office of the High Commissioner with input from relevant special procedure mandate holders as appropriate to present an oral update to the Human Rights Commission at its 24th session and a comprehensive report followed by a discussion on the implementation of the present resolution at its 25th session that is going to be held in March this year. The oral update was given by the United Nations Human Rights Council Commissioner in September last year at its 24th session, and the written report, Mr. High Commissioner, as you are aware, is due in March this year. Taking into account this development, is the situation in Sri Lanka prejudged?
No, I don't think it's a matter of prejudgment at all. Navi Pillay herself came and visited this country, saw what was happening on the ground, as we and other members of the international community present here see what's happening on the ground. And the judgment is that some of those key areas of concern have still not been addressed, and indeed there are concerns about current developments, as I say, in relation to independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. We also have concerns over the series of attacks on religious minorities, on Muslim mosques and Christian churches. So it's by an assessment of what is actually happening on the ground that we in other countries will take a view on Sri Lanka.
Mr. High Commissioner, have you been able to have a dialogue with the Sri Lankan government on this over the last few months or so?
Yes, indeed. I've been able to discuss these issues with key members of the Sri Lankan government and other interested parties in this country. We also travel around Sri Lanka seeing for ourselves what happened on the ground. The Sri Lankan government, as you might expect, defends its positions, but I also think there is some understanding that it may be beneficial for all concerned if there can be progress on reconciliation to achieve that long-term stability, which I'm sure the Sri Lankan government wants and which the United Kingdom also hopes to encourage.
Mr. High Commissioner, does your government believe that the Sri Lankan government may be guilty of war crimes during the final stages of the conflict?
The answer is there have been serious allegations in this area, and those serious allegations need to be properly investigated in a credible and independent fashion. It's once those investigations have taken place that a proper view can be taken as to whether or not the allegations are justified and whether or not there are individuals who should be properly held to account.
What makes you say that, Mr. High Commissioner? Are you basing your argument on the Channel 4 documentaries that were released on Sri Lanka?
Well, the Channel 4 material is one of the pieces of material that need to be looked at in this area. As the government's own LLRC report very clearly stated, there's also the contents of the UN Panel of Experts report and other evidence which has been submitted by other organisations. We don't think these are frivolous issues. We don't think all of this information can simply be dismissed as an international conspiracy. We believe that that evidence needs to be properly investigated. People have questions that need to be answered.